Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we explore the aesthetic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer is one of the most important, if otherwise neglected, philosophers of the 19th century. He is, alongside Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the supreme figures of post-Hegelian philosophy, a critic of the Hegelian historicism that pervades German idealism and scientific socialism like Marxism and social democracy. He is also associated, perhaps most famously, with a sort of pious fatalism, that life is, itself, nothing but death. As Schopenhauer famously wrote, "Existence is certainly to be regarded as an error or mistake, to return from which is salvation." That statement by Schopenhauer encapsulates the heart of Schopenhauer's outlook on life, philosophy, but also aesthetics. Schopenhauer's contributions from phenomenology to philosophy to criticism reaches its climax in his aesthetic attitudes and philosophy, and it is here that we will concentrate. In fact, phenomenology and aesthetics are both intimately intertwined, even though this isn't noticeable at first glance. Schopenhauer stands at the crossroads of Platonic Christianity and Orientalism, principally his limited but still intoxicating understanding of Buddhism. He marries Augustinian eroticism and voluntarism, the philosophy of the will, the belief that humans are principally creatures of will and the heart, with the Buddhist metaphysic of renunciation, that the world is itself the burden of our existence, and ending existence in the body is liberation from the ills and ailments we suffer. This, of course, is what merits Schopenhauer's association with fatalism. Existence sucks, is essentially what he is saying, but yet his marriage of phenomenology and aesthetics and his understanding of the role of aesthetics in modern life is quite impressive and insightful, and one might say prophetic. Because man is fundamentally desire or will, this desire is the nexus of the body and the world of bodies it inhabits. We are objects among objects, and the compulsive eros that drives these bodily objects is ultimately unknowable, the thing in itself, to borrow from Kant, which causes our misery and suffering because we cannot know our deepest desire. This want for knowledge, satisfaction, and contentment is what spurs us on this never-ending quest, but we can never understand why. It is, however, the never-ending quest because we can never know the answer of why. Even though in some sense we are seeking knowledge, satisfaction, and contentment, if we ever achieved it, life would end. But because we can never truly know what our desire aims for, we continue this pursuit of knowledge, serenity, contentment, love, etc., until we die. This is the air of Christianity, according to Schopenhauer, which posits that through union with love, because God is love, serenity can be reached. The superiority of Buddhism, on this account, according to Schopenhauer, is in its recognition that embodied life is awful. Christianity is correct, according to Schopenhauer, that we are fundamentally creatures of the heart, of desire, of the will, but where Buddhism is better is in its recognition that life is awful, despicable, and even evil. This realization, the realization of despairing wisdom, is the closest we get to the contentment of our will and representation. Realizing despair, realizing that existence is awful, is the closest thing to wisdom in life. The one thing in the world of objects that comes closest, however, to this realization of truth, this realization outside of the self, is aesthetics. Aesthetic rapture or experience is Schopenhauer's great gift to the intellectual life and consideration. Aesthetic experience is the closest manifestation of satisfaction because the will is temporarily pacified in the aesthetic experience or encounter as we are overwhelmed by aesthetic sublimity. The encounter with beauty, the encounter with the sublime, the encounter with a great piece of music, a priceless work of art, the overlooking of nature. Anyone who has had such an aesthetic encounter knows what Schopenhauer is talking about. We are, in this moment, completely overwhelmed and pacified, and every desire, every drive we have is temporarily eliminated. Consider also the most moving paintings in the Western tradition and the truth they communicate, according to Schopenhauer, the reality of death. Some of the most recognizable and moving paintings in the artistic tradition of Western civilization deal with death, thereby subtly communicating to us what life is really about. Hector and Achilles, the murder of Julius Caesar, the suicide of Cleopatra, the passion and crucifixion of Christ, the martyrdom of the Christian saints, and the grand spectacles of battle under the landscape of smoke and fire. Aesthetic representations of death capture us, pull us in, and cause our erotic desires to be temporarily suspended in the overwhelming experience of sublimity, which verges on death, just as Edmund Burke explained nearly a century earlier. We are attracted to this kind of aesthetic experience in particular because death is the only escape from the restlessness of life. Here, readers of Schopenhauer who are well versed in theology and Indian studies will see the overlap between Augustinian anthropology, the restless soul, and its desire for beauty as a refuge from lust and sin, with the Buddhist metaphysic of renunciation and world renunciation and bodily renunciation. Aesthetic experience captures this union and points us into the direction of Schopenhauer's assertion that to return from existence, that is, to experience death, is salvation, in the sense that the restless heart, the restless soul, the unknown desire which we are enslaved to, finally dissipates. It only disappears in death. But in our aesthetic experiences, Schopenhauer asserts, we get a mini form, a mini experience of this death, especially when encountering the aesthetics of death, which capture our attention. But since we are unwilling to end our existence through suicide, we seek, paradoxically, continuous aesthetic experiences that bring us the temporary reprieve from existence. Schopenhauer, 100 years before the emergence of classical rock and the idea that music can save your soul, points to this reality of aesthetic transcendence, which we are experiencing today. Philosophers like my former teacher, Roger Scruton, even someone like Jordan Peterson, talk about the relationship of aesthetics and transcendence and our desire to flee the horrors of this world through aesthetic experience. This is exactly what Schopenhauer was talking about 100 years earlier. In aesthetic ecstasy, the restless soul is overwhelmed. We experience a sort of death, so to speak, which brings us to that momentary peace in the aesthetic encounter. In this world of crass consumerism, boredom, and unimportance, art and aesthetics for Schopenhauer is the antidote to our bodily suffering. Schopenhauer can then be taken to his next logical extreme. In a world of meaninglessness, we find meaning in aesthetic experience that represent death. Schopenhauer is a prophet of aestheticism. the man who correctly ascertained that modernity's malaise would lead, paradoxically, to a new interest in art and aesthetics as the escape from all the horror, the ills, the boredom, and the meaninglessness that we experience in modern life. Aesthetics would be the last refuge of meaning, because in aesthetics we experience momentary death. It's no wonder why the greatest artist of aesthetic destruction, Richard Wagner, was the disciple of Schopenhauer when finishing his great work, The Ring of the Nibelung.